상대 지상 중장거리 전략 단도탄 북극성 2형 시험 발사에서 완전 성공. 경의하는 최고領導자 김정은 동지께서 새 전략 무기 시험 발사를 현지에서 지도하셨습니다.
Nous condamnons cette ingérence russe et ce qui s'est passé, puisque tout porte à croire que c'est bien la Russie qui a conduit à ces tentatives d'assassinat.
That's those high school kids. Russians! Russians!
Brodsky.
Alfred, hurry up.
Громадцы, заткните ей глотку. Есть. Только нежно.
That Alphonse? Call Chief Maddox. The Russians have landed. They're here. Do you hear? The Russians in West Village. And I'm being attacked. Stop that. How dare you?
Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The Russians are coming. The Russians are coming. For well over the last year and a half, this is the message Western audiences have been served up 24/7. What is behind this hysteria? What does this message aim to achieve? How is Russia supposed to react? Importantly, are we facing a possible conflict? Cross-talking anti-Russia hysteria. I'm joined by my guest, Lord Richard Balfe in London. He is a member of the UK House of Lords. In Paris, we have John Laughlin. He is a historian specialist in international affairs. And in Washington, we cross to Lee Stranahan. He is an investigative journalist as well as co-host of Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Let me go to John Laughlin in Paris first. John, what do you make of this? Because when a hysterical environment like we see in the United States and the UK and now spreading through Europe, there's no words of reason that can be spoken. No dialogue is allowed whatsoever. And if you question, and if we look at the case in point of this poisoning, alleged poisoning incident in the UK, in Salisbury, you know, I see no evidence whatsoever being provided. I've been asked by Western media outlets to talk about it, and I say, talk about what? There's nothing to talk about until there's some evidence. Can I see some pictures of the guy and his daughter in a hospital? Give me something. No. Just take our word for it. And that's essentially what the Americans said, kicking out so many diplomats at a historical level. We just take the word of our UK colleagues. That is not rational. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are two things that are very frightening about this whole business. One is obviously the geopolitical aspect, but yes, as you say in your question, Peter, the other is what it says about the internal political climate, both within Britain and in the Allied States. I mean, you say there's been no evidence, that's true, but what I think is even worse is the explanations that are given by the British government are completely incoherent. You know, the Foreign Office is making fun of Russia, saying it's offered 30 different explanations. But Boris Johnson says mutually incompatible things in the same sentence. For example, when he appeared in front of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, he said that the Skripals had been attacked with a chemical weapon so that Russia would leave a fingerprint or a footprint on this attack so everyone would know who it was to intimidate other future traitors. And then in the next sentence he said that the Novichok attack had revealed a secret weapons program which Russia had hidden from the international community and from the relevant statutory bodies. Well, these two statements cannot both be true. Either Russia wanted to advertise this as a murder, knowing it would be traced back to Russia, or Russia was trying to keep it secret. But one or the two of them cannot be true at the same time. And indeed, on Thursday, we heard that the police say that the poison was somehow administered through the front door of their house in Wiltshire. Yeah, but I mean, you've been attacked by a chemical weapon, you decide to go to a cemetery, then you go for a beer, then you go for lunch in an Italian restaurant. It takes 4 hours for the chemical weapon to act. I don't call that military grade. I don't think that would work very well on the battlefield, do you?
It's amazing. Let me go to Lord Richard in London. I mean, it seems to me that this hysteria is being conjured up and ginned up because of domestic issues in the U.S. and in the U.K. We see massive political changes going on in Europe, NATO countries, by the way. This is a very interesting way to kind of keep the alliance cohesive because it is fraying. Okay, go ahead in London.
Well, it's fraying, but the whole of this story just doesn't hang together. I mean, we're asked to believe that a member of the Russian Secret Service went to Wiltshire on a Sunday in the middle of the day and sprayed some poison on a doorknob. I mean, come off it. Originally, we were, of course, told she brought it in with her luggage, you know, and yet it's so dangerous that it spreads all over the place. I mean, what did she bring? Her luggage in a lead-lined wheelie bin or something? I mean, no pictures of the people in hospital. I mean, it has certain overtones of a Russian internal dispute between the Russian community in London. It's difficult to stretch it any further. But also, when the Litvenko case was on, there were all sorts of pictures from the hospital. We've seen nothing. Why? What's going on here?
You know, Lee, let me go to you.
And of course, the police who are involved in it, Wiltshire Police, the most incompetent police force in Britain that tried to frame ex-Prime Minister Edward Heath. I wouldn't trust them to look for my cat if it was missing, let alone anything bigger.
Okay, let me go to Lee here. Lee, you know, one of the questions I asked in my introduction is that what does Washington and London expect Russia to do if there is no evidence provided proving guilt? The Russians are just left kind of bewildered here. Oh, and you have no evidence, you won't share the evidence, but you're going down this path of expulsions with other things being threatened in the future. I mean, what, you know, from the Russian point of view, you know, how are they supposed to react to this kind of hysteria? It's like dealing with an adolescent. Go ahead, Lee.
Well, I'll tell you, let me take a slightly contrary position. I actually don't think this is exactly about domestic policy. I think this is about covering up in particular, U.S. foreign policy disasters, specifically in Syria and Ukraine. Let me say this. Ukraine, for instance, we see that NATO has already come out and said, well, we're expelling diplomats. The poisoning's part of it, but also annexing Crimea, et cetera, right? They don't want people to know that what happened in Crimea came right after the U.S. fomented a coup in Ukraine, which, and this is the other thing, it's not being reported in the media, but anybody can look it up, it's not working out well. Poroshenko, who the U.S. backed in Ukraine, is not very popular. In fact, his favorable rating is not only below Trump's, it's below Hillary Clinton's. He's about a 6% favorable rating. In Syria right now, we're 70 days or so into this Afrin disaster, where we have one U.S. ally, Turkey, working with another U.S. ally, the Free Syria Army, to attack a different U.S. ally, the Kurds. It's a complete ruin. And so I have been worried about this ever since
Well, you know what?
I was just going to say, I went to Lebanon in 2013. I saw this for myself.
I think that you're onto something here, but I think that it's really, you know, the so-called Russia threat and this hysteria that is created, it's really one size fits all. I mean, it does serve the purpose of, I'm going to John here now in Paris, it does serve the purpose of masking failures, because everything is a failure now when it comes to foreign policy, one right after another, okay? In this particular case, Russia was invited into Syria, so that's why they can pin something on Russia. But I still think, I strongly believe that a lot of it is domestically driven, and Russia is a good punching bag. It's the good old favored boogeyman. You even hear people in the U.S. National Security Council and the Pentagon saying those things in public. Thank goodness things are getting back to normal. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I do think there's a geopolitical angle. Firstly, there's no doubt that since the Ukraine revolution, since the annexation of Crimea, or the reintegration of Crimea, and of course since the intervention in Syria, Russia has started to fight back. Let's not forget that the Americans under Wolfowitz in 1992 said that they wanted full spectrum dominance. And Russia has started to redress very slightly the geopolitical balance. And I do believe that that is one of the aggravating factors. But I also think that the aggravating factors in this Russian hysteria, but I also think there's a very specific reason to this specific Skripal case, which goes beyond the Syrian and Crimean cases, and that is that Britain has a particular need within the context of the Brexit negotiations.
Yes.
Theresa May, when she became Prime Minister, said she wanted a full free trade agreement with the European Union. I believe that was a major strategic error on her part, because it put her in the position of someone who wanted something from Brussels.
Yep.
Well, because she wants something from Brussels, she has to give something in return. And what Britain can offer in return is military power and the secret services. In other words, the British have a clear motive for trying to show the Europeans that the Europeans need them. They need their protection. They need their security services, and they need their armies. And we can see this in all kinds of areas, not just in the Skripal case. We see it, for example, also in the fact that the British commissioner now in Brussels is the commissioner for the Security Union. He's a former ambassador who's worked on security issues all his life. And the British, in other words, are being given the role, if you like, of creating for themselves and for the European Union in the future a security role in which Britain, once Brexit has happened, will continue to play and will continue to weigh. So that's my view about the geopolitical imperative behind this particular case, against a background of much bigger geopolitical rivalry with Russia over many years.
Yeah, Lord Richard Balfour, I think it's really interesting how the British Prime Minister has used this issue, because she's been very vocal on it. You know, she was right out at the gate when this happened here. And I agree with John Laughlin that this has a lot to do with the difficulties of Brexit, what kind of relationship the UK is going to have with the European Union. It plays very well. Go ahead in London.
Well, the first reality, of course, is that if you leave a club, you're never as well off as if you're in a club. And there's no way that Britain is going to be better off outside the European Union than it is inside it. So that's point one. Yes, of course, Britain has a security role, but so has France. France is an independent nuclear power. Britain is not. Britain is a US-dependent nuclear power. I think there's something in this, but Skripal does not make sense. He'd been here for 12 years. If he hadn't been debriefed, I can't believe he was any use as a security asset. So why they've chosen him, I still go back to my favoured theory, which is that it was an internal Russian émigré spat. And we still haven't got to the bottom of where his connections were. Things have leaked out about he was friends with this person. He used to go to a Russian shop in Waterloo and God knows what. I think he was more closely involved in the Russian community than we've been told.
Okay,
and I wouldn't be surprised if this wasn't an internal revenge
I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a break, and I definitely agree with you. You know, Britain is the God's playground for oligarchs and you know, a lot of other unsavory characters that Britain let in. We're going to go to a break now. After our break, we'll continue our discussion on the anti-Russia hysteria. Stay with RT.
Nous avons en effet obtenu par nos services et les services de nos alliés des preuves que du chlore, des armes chimiques, avait été utilisé. Nous avons ensuite obtenu la preuve que ces armes pouvaient être attribuées, l'utilisation du chlore, puisque c'est de cela dont il s'agissait, pouvait être attribuée
au régime syrien.
We can speak now to the Labour peer and former head of the Royal Navy, Lord West. He joins us from our Westminster studios. And thank you very much for your time this morning. You've been casting some doubt on what's been happening, the evidence, according to our own Defence Secretary, according to President Macron of France and others, about what happened in Douma, saying that the evidence doesn't really fit well for President Assad ordering a chemical attack. Just tell us more about your thoughts on that, first of all.
Yes, President Assad is in the process of winning this civil war, and he was about to take over and occupy Douma, all that area. He'd had a long, long, hard slog, slowly capturing that whole area of the city. And there, just before he goes in and takes it all over, apparently he decides to have a chemical attack. It just doesn't ring true. It seems extraordinary because clearly he would know that there's likely to be a response from the Allies. What benefit is there for his military? Most of the rebel fighters, this disparate group of Islamists had withdrawn. There were a few women and children left around. What benefit was there militarily in doing what he did? I find that extraordinary. Whereas we know that in the past some of the Islamic groups have used chemicals, and of course there would be huge benefit in them labelling an attack as coming from Assad, because they would guess quite rightly that there'd be a response from the US, as there was last time, and possibly from the UK and France.
Is it fair to say, though, that you're looking at this from the point of view of strategy and tactics rather than any evidence?
Absolutely, although we do know that the reports that came from there were from the White Helmets, who, let's face it, are not neutrals. You know, they're very much on the side of the disparate groups who are fighting Assad, and also the World Health Organization doctors who are there. And again, those doctors are embedded in amongst the groups, doing fantastic work, I know, but they're not neutral. And I am just a little bit concerned, because as we now move to the next phase in this war, if I were advising some of the Islamist groups, many of whom are worse than Daesh, I would say, look, we've got to wait until there's another attack by Assad's forces, particularly if they have a helicopter overhead or something like that and they're dropping barrel bombs, and we must set off some chlorine, because we'll get the next attack from the Allies. And there's no doubt that if we believe he's done a chemical attack, we should do that. And those attacks will get bigger. And it is the only way they have got, actually, of stopping the inevitable victory of Assad.
Are you saying that there may be something faulty with the intelligence, the proof that President Macron has said he has, with the, to quote the Defence Secretary here, Gavin Williamson, the significant body of intelligence which suggests the Assad regime is responsible for what happened in Douma? Are you suggesting there may be faulty intelligence behind all of this?
I think if it's saying it suggests it did it, I'm not sure that's strong enough. If they've got, and I'm not privy to this, if they've got really good intelligence, let's say, for example, GCHQ or NSA intercepts of Syrian officers discussing an attack and saying, yes, let's use chlorine, then OK, fine. And I have no difficulty with what was done, none at all. I think if he has used chemical weapons, it's absolutely right to do a rap across his knuckles to show him that the international community are not willing to put up with this, and it's right to do it. But I just wonder, you know, we've had some bad experiences on intelligence. When I was Chief of Defence Intelligence, I had huge pressure put on me politically to try and say that our bombing campaign in Bosnia was achieving all sorts of things, which it wasn't. I was put under huge pressure. So I know the things that can happen with intelligence, and I would just like to be absolutely sure.
We know that the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said on Friday, or accused a Western state on Friday of perhaps fabricating evidence in Douma or somehow being involved with what happened in Douma. Given that we're in an information war with Russia on so many fronts, do you think perhaps it's inadvisable to be stating this so publicly, given your position and your profile? Isn't there a danger that you're muddying the waters?
Well, I think the answer is, if there's a real concern, let's face it, if he hasn't done it, then that is extremely bad news. You know, if Assad hasn't carried out the attack, and I think it's just worth making that clear. I think our government's policy towards Assad has not been clever since 2013. To say we're not going to have anything to do with him, he's not the president, we're not going to have anything to do with him, is flying in the face of realpolitik, of facts on the ground. And he's a nasty, unpleasant, horrible person. There's no doubt about that. But the reality is he's there. And our policy of not talking to him almost has, if anything, prolonged this civil war.
Do you have concerns, though, about giving
war.
credence, perhaps, to the Russians?
Well, I have to say that the Russians talking about another power doing it is complete nonsense. And the Russians, I'm afraid, lie as a matter of policy. So I have no truck with that. And so I'm not paying attention to what they're saying, to be quite honest. It's just my concern. You know, militarily, it just seems extraordinary. And I don't think we can always rely on some of the reports that come from within these areas, because it's not from neutral observers.
But if you are right and an opposition group, a rebel group, did do this, then the Western nations who've been involved in these strikes have made a massive blunder, haven't they? And the implications are huge.
Well, certainly, if that is the case, we've been duped. But these things happen in war. And, you know, but I think, yes, we would have been duped. And I think we will learn a lesson from that, because if it's done again, we'll be a little bit more careful. But as I say, I hope, against hope, that they have got absolutely cast iron intelligence, in which case the action that was conducted was absolutely right to slap him across his wrist. There is no doubt Assad is a loathsome man. There's no doubt in the past he has used chemical weapons, and there is a real danger of this creeping acceptance of chemical weapons being used, and that is a worry. So that's really the balance of how I would put across my view.
OK, Lord West, thank you very much.
Okay, Lee, as I said in the introduction here, we've been watching this thing unfold, this hysteria, this fictional, a real conspiracy theory conjured up by the political elites and the media. Where does it stop? Because it seems like it's taken on a life of its own. It has a momentum of its own, because when you look to connect dots in a conspiracy theory, you can find a lot of dots, because you've left your senses, okay? You only see what you want to see. And a lot of people are scoring political points on this. Journalist number one, this is a gravy train. You can say whatever you want and you'll never be held accountable, because there's no conspiracy behind it. You don't understand how deep it all is. This is what drives people insane, and we have it on a societal level right now. Go ahead, Lee, in Washington.
Well, here's what I think is interesting about it. You brought up the media, and that is a great point, because that's the other thing that's going on here. Globally, because of technology, because everybody's got a cell phone, everybody has internet access, the media's grip on a monopoly on information about news and politics has changed, and they are desperately worried about that. I think, and again, this is my view, and you're never going to hear this from the media, people aren't buying it. What I've said is, in a sense, we're watching like the Gulf of Tonkin play out in real time. Remember, the Gulf of Tonkin was what got the U.S. into the Vietnam War. And years later, we figured out that was a fake story. People right now, my sense is, if you talked to people in America and you said, are you buying this Russia narrative? At least 30% or so are going to be like, no, not at all. Not at all. Possibly higher. Now, they're never going to poll on that. But what I'm saying is, despite the fact that the media is beating the same drum every single day, I don't think it's working with the American people, because the fact is, people are doing their own research.
Yes,
they can look into it themselves.
Lee, what's important here, Lee, I tend to agree with you, okay? But what is important is that the population, they're not polled and they're not asked to vote on what should be done about it. That's left to the powers that be, and they're very pliant media stenographers, okay? John, let me go to you, because, like I said, this has a momentum of its own, and how do you back down? How do you de-escalate when you start making these horrific historical comparisons? See, I've been saying this for a half a year. You can ratchet up, but you don't know how to go down. And then you get to a tipping point where it gets to a point of pride and hubris. And that's when the worst decisions are made. Think of August 1914. Go ahead, John.
Well, history is littered with examples like this, but I don't think they want to ratchet it down. They want to ratchet it up. Even if it had been an attack committed by the Russian state, which I don't for a minute accept, there might have been other ways of dealing with it. We know that the ultimatum was given and then the expulsions were announced by London before any evidence could possibly have been acquired, because on the day before the expulsions were announced in the House of Commons by Mrs. May, the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police in charge of counter-terrorism said the investigation was very complicated and would be going on for weeks or months. So, again, you know, we know that the police do not know how the poison got there. So if the police don't know, then how can the government know? So we know that the goal is to ratchet it up. And the reason why it's to ratchet up is for the reason I gave earlier. They need to secure the cohesion of the Atlantic Alliance and the European Union, just as they did on MH17. You remember the Malaysian airliner shot down over, or which crashed over Ukraine. Before coming on the programme, I went onto the website of the Dutch authority, which is supposed to be launching a criminal investigation into that. In other words, say who they think did it. Do you know when their last press conference was? It was in September 2016. So, in other words, the inquiry has run into the sands.
Yep.
Or, for that matter, Yushchenko. You remember the Yushchenko poisoning? That was another Russian-backed poisoning in Ukraine in 2004. Where do you think that inquiry went for 5 years when Yushchenko was president of Ukraine and had the entire Ukrainian state apparatus at his disposal? Nowhere. The fact is that these allegations are made, they are milked for all they're worth politically, and then they're forgotten about. And I expect if you invite us on in a year or two about Skripal, we'll find the same thing has happened with him.
Lord Richard Balfe, weigh in on that, because do you see more ratcheting? I mean, I agree, because we have a history of this, but I mean, how far can it go before there is a crisis point here, okay? I mean, you had the lunatic Nikki Haley, you know, unbelievable. You know, I always say that she has a PhD in hillbilly studies, and now she represents the United States at the UN, okay? I mean, she said it could happen in New York City. I mean, talk about crisis mongering. And in what I've noticed over the last year and a half, it is preparing Western audiences for some kind of conflict. Go ahead, in London.
Well, this is what worries me, because I think we need to de-escalate. I mean, we've gone on and on about the Crimea. My solution is quite simple. Have a UN-sponsored poll there as to whether they want to be in Russia. I'm pretty sure I know the answer. But we have a precedent. We had one in Saarland in 1950s. So, you know, if we want to de-escalate, we could. But de-escalation cannot be done with the present Foreign Secretary and Defence Secretary grandstanding around. Possibly Philip Hammond, who was the last Foreign Secretary, would be a much better choice because he's a bit calmer. But we have to de-escalate, because if this carries on, what are we going to do? The British people, I do not think, will accept war. And that's where it's leading to. That's where all of this rhetoric is leading to. And we've got to de-escalate it for the sake of the continent.
Let me go back to Lee in Washington. Lord Richard Balfe is absolutely right, but it's not going to happen because of hubris. Okay, this is the problem. The authors of these narratives, of these fake stories, have painted themselves into a corner. Because if you choose the path of de-escalation, then that's called appeasement, and that will not be allowed. This is why this is a dangerous dead end. Because even having a rational discussion about it means you're a Putin troll. That's where we are. Unfortunately. Go ahead, Lee.
Well, I'll tell you, I've thought a lot about this, obviously, because, look, I work for Sputnik. I work for Sputnik because I saw through this Russia thing. I wouldn't work for Sputnik if I thought the demonization that I hear were true. But I looked into it myself, and I see what's going on. I'm going to tell you, it's a radical suggestion. I think it's going to have to come from Russia and from Vladimir Putin in particular. If Vladimir, imagine this, just imagine this. What if Vladimir Putin started doing addresses to the West, directly to the West, 5 minutes on YouTube once a week? Here's my perspective, here's what I think. Now, they would go nuts. The media would go nuts because the fact is they would try to do what they've done to Assange, which is just shut him down. But the fact is that would only make people want to listen more. And I think I have no hope that this is going to happen from the west side.
It's kind of
too much
it's
invested
kind of
in
an
it.
interesting idea, John. It'd be, you know, that's akin to Trump on Twitter here. Knowing the style of Vladimir Putin, I don't think that's something he would do. But Maria Zakharova is playing that role right now, and I think quite effectively. John, where is this all going? What the goal is? What in the West is just have Russia surrender its sovereignty and break itself up and allow neoliberalism to scour the Russian economy. I mean, I don't know what the goal is. When did they say we've achieved what we wanted? There's no set goal. Stop bad behavior. I don't know what that means because I see the West involved in bad behavior all the time, and no one is stopping them. Go ahead, John.
Well, the fact is there is a big geopolitical battle. I said earlier that Crimea and Ukraine represent geopolitical victories for Russia against a background of 20 years, 25 years in which the West and the Americans in particular have wanted to have full spectrum dominance. In other words, they've wanted to dominate all areas of military activity and to do so in a way that even a coalition of allies could not possibly threaten them. And they've achieved that because the Americans have, because as we know, American military spending is equivalent to the spending of the 7 next countries added up together. I think to understand the current environment, we have to look at a document that was produced, the National Security Strategy document produced on January the 19th of this year by the American administration, which changes the view of Russia and China from the previous Obama administration and says that Russia and China are now strategic rivals. Obama had left open the possibility that there could be cooperation. And Trump himself, in spite of his occasional friendly words towards Russia, has said that he wants to maintain this total full-spectrum dominance, and he doesn't want any country or coalition of countries to be able to threaten it. And therefore, that's the goal. So that is the answer. And, if you ask me what I think the worst-case scenario is, I'm afraid I have to say that Boris Johnson mentioned at the dinner, the Guildhall dinner on Wednesday, he said it was like Crime and Punishment. I'm afraid it's War and Peace. Trump has just appointed one of the craziest men in the world, John Bolton, to be National Security Advisor, whose answer to everything is war and preventive war if necessary. These people are crazy. I would be tempted to say Trump is the only sane man in the White House, but I'm afraid I don't even think that that's true. But in other words, I think that they are spoiling for a fight.
Okay, well, John, let me ask you also. I mean, do you think that this is a concerted agenda? Could we expect another horrific story, another poisoning or something like that as we come up to the World Cup?
Oh, well, who knows? I mean, these things come along every 5 minutes, don't they, these new accusations, whether it's MH17 or Yushchenko or fake news or, they just never stop. So I think, yes, the World Cup is obviously going to be a moment which will be very uncomfortable for the West because it would show, a pleasanter side of Russia, and that is something they want to avoid.
And that's something
so
they're terrified of, because if you compare Moscow to a lot of Western cities now, Moscow looks better. Many thanks to my guests in London, Paris, and in Washington, D.C.